Morning, church. Good to see you. We're in the midst of quite a season at the moment. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of change happening. And we're going to be focusing our time this morning in Exodus chapter 16 as we look at the people of Israel and as we think about their story. I'm going to be using the word story an awful lot this morning. I'd like us to think about the stories that we tell ourselves as a community, as individuals, and I think this also has relevance to the stories we tell as a nation. But I wonder, how do you know where you are in a story? How do you, when you're listening to a story or you're reading a story, how do you know at what point, how do you situate yourself within that story? My mum was a primary school teacher for all of her career, and she used to say to me when I was writing stories as a child, a good story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A fairly obvious thing to say, but I think it's a profound point that a good story should start somewhere, have a middle section where other things happen, and then finish somewhere else at the end. Maybe you've had the experience of getting through a book and not really being sure what's going on, and you literally open the book and look at it side on and say, how far am I through this book? How many pages has actually taken place so far, and how many pages have I got left to do? I don't understand what this author's doing. Maybe as you're telling the story of your life or the story of your career, you think about it in terms of years. You know, you have the early years where you're working really hard to make something of yourself, and then you have the middle years where other things happen, and then you finish your final years have a different flavor to them, a different feel than the original years. A good story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. What about where the climactic scene in a story is? Or what do you do in a story where crisis hits? You know, storytellers and story theorists know where in a good story the climactic scene should happen and where the crisis moments should hit. This is a bit of an aside, but as I listen to different generations in 2020 talk about COVID-19, one of the things I'm hearing is different generations describing a crisis at different points in their own story. Depending on how old you are, you interpret COVID-19 and the crisis that we're in at the moment differently because it comes at a different place in your story. What about the story of a church and the story a church has been telling itself for years? Sometimes really good authors will do things that feel weird or out of place. They tell stories in an odd way. I don't know if you've read Lord of the Rings, but Frodo throws the ring into Mount Doom, and then there's like 100 pages left of the book. Or if you've watched the film, it's like 45 minutes left in the film, and you're like, what's going... Well, this is not a good story. Why is there all this story left to be told? We've had our climactic scene. We've had our moment. The ring is in Mount Doom. What else is happening? For many of us who have read the story of the Exodus, maybe we grew up in church or we've been in church for long enough, we know the story of the Exodus. And maybe if you've watched the film and you're thinking to yourself, why on earth is Batman trying to get the people of Israel out of Egypt? It's a niche joke, but some of you got it. I'd like to suggest this morning that we only know half of the story of Exodus. Today, we're going to be looking at Exodus chapter 16. But it's worth pointing out that the book of Exodus has 40 chapters in it, and we're at chapter 16. So that should tell you something about where we are in the story. A good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we're at chapter 16. It's kind of halfway, but still towards the beginning of a 40-chapter book. And the people of Israel are already out of Egypt. They're already in the wilderness. So if you think about the story of Exodus as being about getting Israel out of Egypt, may I gently suggest this morning that you don't know what the book of Exodus is really about. Maybe the book of Exodus is more than just getting the people of Israel out of Egypt. Here's something I'd like us to take away from this morning. Everyone thinks that Exodus is about getting Israel out of Egypt, and it's actually about getting the Egypt out of Israel, discovering what it's actually like to be the people of Israel. And what we discover from the book of Exodus is that's the difficult bit. Getting the Egypt out of Israel is the hard bit. Let me say that again. Everyone thinks that Exodus is about getting Israel out of Egypt. But the story is actually about getting the Egypt out of Israel. And what do I mean by that? You can take the boy out of Texas, but can you take the Texas out of the boy? Thankfully, we have got our brother John out of Texas. And yet still, I find him wearing knee-high cowboy boots and saying yeehaw at random times of day or night. You can take the boy out of Exodus, but can you get Texas out of the boy? It turns out that as Israel left Egypt, they brought with them Egypt in their hearts. The idolatry, the greed for power, the tendency towards hate and covetousness. So, what I'd like to do very quickly is give you an overview of Exodus, to kind of ram this point home, but then to situate our chapter 16, in the middle of that. So, the story of Exodus goes something like this. We're all familiar with it. You have the people of Israel in Egypt, and then we're introduced to Moses, our protagonist, and Pharaoh, our villain. And the people of Egypt are in bondage, in slavery. The people of Israel, I'm going to do this all morning, I'm sorry. The people of Israel are in bondage in Egypt. And Moses meets Yahweh, the great I Am, at the burning bush. And God commissions Moses to bring his people out. And so he sends 10 plagues, these powerful signs of deliverance. And slowly over the course of those signs, Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh has his heart hardened, and he refuses to let the people go. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, which mirrors the way Pharaoh killed the firstborn of Israel, happens on the same night as the Passover. God's judgment literally passes over Israel because they've covered their doorposts with the blood of the Lamb. Pharaoh lets the people of Israel go, and the Exodus begins. Then, in a dramatic change, Pharaoh changes his mind and tries to chase down the people of Israel. And at the point as they're crossing the Red Sea, which God has miraculously parted for them, they cross over the far side, and while Pharaoh is in the middle of the waters come crashing down on him, and Israel is free. They're out of Egypt. The end. Climactic moment, story drawn to an end. That's the first 15 chapters of a 40-chapter book. So the question I hope you're asking at home is, what happens in the rest of the book? The book is split into two halves. You have the Exodus from Egypt, and you have the covenant at Mount Sinai. And then if you're thinking about the covenant of Mount Sinai, two really important things happen at Mount Sinai. First, they're given the law, and then they're taught how to build the tabernacle. By giving the law, what I mean is that God teaches Israel how to live his way with Yahweh as their king. And by what I mean by building of the tabernacle is God gives Israel his presence. He gives them his glory so that he will go with them wherever they are. It turns out that if you want to get the Egypt out of Israel, you need to teach people how to live. You need to give them God's presence. And in between these two chunks, the Exodus of Egypt and the covenant at Mount Sinai, we have the first of our 3 chapters today. Chapters 16, 17, and 18. They sit between the two halves of the book, and we're going to focus on chapter 16 at the moment. Do you see now why I think that the book of Exodus is not about getting the people of Israel out of Egypt, but it's about getting the Egypt out of Israel? And it turns out that's the harder thing to do. So, now that we've situated ourselves in chapter 16, we have the story of the gods giving the manna. Israel, maybe like us, feels like they've had their climactic moment. They've had the parting of the Red Sea. They've had the 10 signs of deliverance. They've seen God work in miraculous ways to pull them out of slavery. They think that's the end of the story. Job done. The ring is in the fire. We can all go home now, Frodo. And they find themselves in the wilderness. They find themselves not where they wanted to be. This is not how the story's supposed to end. And so they start grumbling about it. Remember the good old days? Remember how great it was in Egypt? They start misremembering the past. It becomes the glory years. And in these 3 chapters, 16, 17, and 18, God provides for his people in the wilderness. Firstly, he provides bread from heaven. And then in chapter 17, he provides water from the rock. And then in chapter 18, he provides wisdom for healthy community leadership. Bread from heaven, water from the rock, wisdom for healthy community leadership. So God provides for his people in the wilderness. This story of God providing manna is a fascinating story, and because of the way I've structured today's sermon, we don't have time to go into all the details, but I'd like to just draw out 3 things. Firstly, in verse 15. Verse 15 says this: when the Israelites saw it, as in the stuff on the ground that God had put there for them to eat, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." Now that phrase, "what is it?" in ancient Hebrew, not biblical Hebrew, but ancient Hebrew, there's a story to be told there, but I can't get into it now. In ancient Hebrew, the phrase, "what is it?" is pronounced manna. And so the word for this bread that God had provided for them became the phrase, "What is this stuff? What is it?" There was something about God's miraculous provision of bread that they could not understand to such a degree that that became the name for it. They called this stuff, "We don't know what this is. We just know God's providing it. We don't understand it, but we know that God is sustaining us through this season." So I'd like to suggest to you this morning that you should not be surprised if during this season you find your needs met in unexplainable ways. That God will provide, what is this? Moments of provision. And I'd ask that you would be on the lookout for those moments and that you would tell us when they happen. Tell us about your, what is this? Moments, the moments that God provides in the wilderness. Secondly, verse 23. Verse 23 says this: "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." Now, probably, as you heard this passage being read, you went, "Oh yeah, Sabbath, we know about Sabbath." But this is the first time that the word Sabbath is used in the Bible, and it's the second time since Genesis chapter 2 that we have the idea of resting on the 7th day. This is actually before God has even given the law to the people where they're told to take a Sabbath rest. Again, that's complicated. We don't have time to get into it, and actually it doesn't really matter. The point is, in the wilderness, God will provide us with rest. God provides us with rest in the wilderness. And again, for our community today, this might seem strange because some of us are working extraordinarily hard at the moment. hours and hours above their pay grade. I'm thinking of the wardens, I'm thinking of the vestry, I'm thinking of members of our staff, my brother John, working extremely hard at the moment. And somehow, the Bible says, Exodus 16 points to the fact that in the wilderness, God can give us rest. God can provide more than we need of this what is it stuff so that we can actually have rest in this season. And as we let that hit home, verse 34 says this: As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant. We're talking about the manna for safekeeping. Moses has said to Aaron, take a jar and put an omer of manna in it and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. And so Aaron did what Moses commanded. What the people of Israel end up doing with this what is it stuff, this incredible act of provision in the wilderness, what Israel ends up doing is taking some of it and setting it aside and putting it on the altar in the tabernacle to say, we need to remember the incredible faithfulness of God that he provided for us in the wilderness. So that hundreds of years after these events took place, the Jewish people could walk into the temple and see an omer of manna and say, and remember the stories that their parents told them, and say, that's the stuff that God used to provide in the wilderness. Now, it is not my place really to tell you your history. I'm a new boy here, and I wish Paul was here, but I've had enough conversations with Paul to know that actually this room that I'm currently in is filled with symbols of God's faithfulness. I've heard enough of the story of how we got moved out of the big building that we were in into this small building because actually the diocese wanted to close this place. And we took a few things with us, the angel on the wall, a few touch points from that old building. We brought them in here, and what did God do? He turned this place around. He provided for us in our wilderness moments. And we have those things, those symbols to point at and say, God is faithful. That's what happens with the manna in the wilderness. That's what happens in our day. And it's a testament to God's faithfulness for us this morning in our latest wilderness experience. Here's what I'm trying to say, folks. For many people, the news that we've been expressing and experiencing in recent weeks feels like we're back in the wilderness again. I thought our story was supposed to be different. Haven't we had our climactic scene? Haven't we been in the wilderness and then we came out of it? The story's over. The job is done. We've had that moment of success. My dear friends, it is in the wilderness that God will sustain us. He will give us rest. God will show himself to be faithful to us. We don't know the story that God is trying to teach us, the story that God has us in right now. The people of Israel didn't know what story they were in. They thought their story was over after 15 chapters. Turned out God had a lot more work he wanted to do with them. And so, as we find ourselves in this time, I trust that God knows the story that he has us in and that he will take us forward. And in closing, like I say, I don't know what story we're in, but I do know another story. I know a story about a man who said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never become hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I know a story about a man who took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed thousands of people in the wilderness. I know a story of a man who taught his disciples to say, give us this day our daily bread. And I know a story of a man who broke bread and gave it to his disciples, saying, take, eat. This is my body broken for you. if in this season you have any doubt that God will provide for us in this wilderness, that God will give us rest, and that God will be faithful to us during this time, look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. He is the bread of life. He is our sustenance, and the cross and resurrection is the enduring act of provision for us today. Do you know what story you're in? The book of Exodus isn't a story about getting Israel out of Egypt. It's actually about getting Egypt out of Israel. The Israelites didn't know that. So once they got out of Egypt, it looked like their story had taken a strange turn. This is not what we were expecting. And the manna in the wilderness shows us that God provides good gifts for his people, and he will provide for us. So, my friends, I don't know where our story is going. Many of us feel like we're back in the wilderness today. Maybe in hindsight, we actually never left the wilderness. I'm not sure. But I do know that God is faithful. I know that he gives good gifts to his people, and that he will see us through. In Jesus' name, amen.